Chapter 1. The Challenge. The stars were scattered like diamonds across the inky expanse of space, a sprawling tapestry that stretched on infinitely, as far as the eye could see. Between them, small ships passed by, some headed for trade stations, others heading into the unknown. In this vastness, amidst the humming of engines and the glow of distant suns, there existed a place where the laws of the universe were tested by strength, by honor, and by fierce willpower. For the beings who called it home, this was no mere battlefield, it was their test of worth, a place where they could prove that they were stronger than their rivals, that they were the one who deserved to rule, to conquer, to hold the galaxy in their hands. And within this place, standing at the edge of the Colosseum's grand arena, stood Zalara, the T-Rex queen, her lithe form covered in the dark, armored exoskeleton that was both her shield and her identity. Her people were feared across the stars, known for their violent conquest of worlds, their skill in hand-to-hand combat, and their ability to crush their enemies underfoot, without mercy or hesitation. Zalara had spent most of her life climbing the ranks of power through sheer strength, battling her way through countless warriors, and defeating each challenger who dared cross her path. And now, as the arena's artificial sun beat down on her, casting long shadows on the dusty ground below, she could feel the anticipation in the air. There was no turning back. The audience, hundreds of thousands of spectators from every corner of the galaxy, watched in silence, their eyes locked on the center of the arena, where Zalara stood in perfect stillness, her cold, violet eyes scanning the expanse, waiting for her opponent. She had been summoned to this place to face a human warrior, someone who had apparently gained fame in a series of conflicts between the human colonies and other galactic powers. The idea that this human, this mere mortal, could pose any challenge to her was laughable. After all, what could a species as fragile as humans possibly offer in a fight to the death? Zalara had read the reports. She knew that the human warrior had a reputation, that his exploits had earned him the attention of powerful people across the galaxy. But none of that mattered to her. She had faced alien creatures more terrifying than any human, survived brutal wars, and emerged victorious time and time again. The thought of losing to this human was inconceivable. His name was Dorian Drake, and she had heard whispers of his strength and cunning. They said that he was a soldier, a warrior bred for battle, with skills that rivaled even the most skilled of the T-Rex. They said he had bested entire squads of alien warriors, taken on beasts that no human should ever have been able to defeat. The stories intrigued Zalara, but she dismissed them as mere legend. For her, no one could ever defeat her in combat. Dorian Drake was human. She had already seen the weakness in his eyes, the hesitation that might slip in at the wrong moment. She had heard the way the crowd spoke of him, how they praised him as though he were some kind of hero, a champion. But heroes fell, and legends crumbled. She was Zalara, queen of the T-Rex, and no one, not even this so-called human, was going to stand in her way. The sound of footsteps echoed across the arena as the gates on the opposite end of the battlefield slid open. The audience gasped as a figure stepped into the arena, the human warrior, Dorian Drake, his tall frame silhouetted against the harsh light of the artificial sun. His armor was simple compared to the elaborate, battle-worn exoskeleton Zalara wore, but it was clear from his stride that it was designed for practicality and efficiency. There was no grandeur in his entrance, no frills, no unnecessary flourishes. Just a man, confident in his purpose. And in that moment, Zalara felt a flicker of something unexpected, a strange sensation that prickled at the back of her mind. She couldn't explain it. He was a human, his form was frail, his muscles not as pronounced as the warriors she was accustomed to facing. His face was serious, his expression unreadable, and yet there was something about the way he walked, the way he moved, that made her pause. Was it respect? Fear? No, it couldn't be. She dismissed the thought quickly, pushing it from her mind. This was nothing more than a simple challenge. She had faced opponents who were stronger, faster, more cunning. This human would be no different. The two warriors stood across from each other in the arena, the distance between them vast, but the tension thick enough to slice through the air. The audience, which had been murmuring in excitement, now fell silent, their eyes glued to the center of the arena. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation. This was no ordinary fight. This was the moment where two worlds collided, where Zalara would show the galaxy that even the fiercest of humans was no match for the T-Rex. Zalara could hear the faint beating of her heart in her chest, as she flexed her fingers, the sharp claws of her hands gleaming in the light. She adjusted her stance, moving her weight forward, prepared to strike at any moment. Her senses were sharp, her reflexes faster than any human could hope to match. She could already see the gaps in his stance, the weaknesses in his armor. There would be no mercy, no hesitation. She would strike fast and decisively. But Dorian Drake was not backing down. He raised his head slowly, his eyes meeting hers with a steady gaze, a look that almost seemed familiar. He wasn't intimidated by her presence. There was no fear in his eyes, only calm resolve. That unsettling sensation in Zalara's mind flickered again. She shook it off, focusing on the battle ahead. She was the hunter here. He was the prey. And she would make sure that he realized just how outmatched he truly was. The arena's loudspeakers crackled to life, the voice of the announcer booming across the battlefield. Fighters, the challenge is set. No rules. No quarter. Fight until one is victorious. Begin. Without hesitation, Zalara lunged forward, her powerful legs propelling her across the dusty ground. Her movement was swift, a blur of speed as she closed the distance between them in seconds. She had calculated her attack with precision, aiming for his neck one clean strike, and the fight would be over. But to her surprise, Dorian moved. He didn't run, didn't flinch. Instead, he pivoted on his heel with a speed she hadn't expected, narrowly dodging her swipe, his own hand snapping out to grab her arm. The shock that coursed through her body as his grip locked onto her forearm was immediate. She hadn't anticipated the strength in his hold, the way he redirected her momentum with a fluid motion that made her stumble slightly. "What?" Zalara hissed, her voice low with a mix of disbelief and growing anger. She tore her arm free, her claws glinting in the light as she slashed at him. But Dorian was already moving again, his body dodging and weaving, anticipating her every move. He was faster than any human should have been. For the first time, Zalara hesitated. This wasn't going according to plan. She had always been the one to control the pace of the fight, to force her opponents to submit to her will. But Dorian, this human, was different. He was strong, yes, but it wasn't just his physical strength. There was something more in his movements, a precision in his attacks that was unnerving, as if he had studied her every move, as if he had anticipated her strategy before she even made it. For a split second, Zalara felt herself thrown off balance, her thoughts scattering as she tried to adjust. This wasn't supposed to happen. Zalara's mind raced as she quickly recalibrated. Her senses were sharper than any human's, and she knew that hesitation was a dangerous thing in battle. She had been trained since birth to be a warrior. Her entire existence had been dedicated to perfection, to supremacy on the battlefield. Every move, every strike, had been honed to an almost deadly precision. And yet, here she was, facing a human, a being she had once dismissed as nothing more than a fragile creature. And suddenly, she felt the reality of her mistake. Dorian's movement had caught her off guard, but it was more than just a simple dodge. It was calculated, deliberate, as though he had studied her fighting style, as if he knew exactly how she would react. For the first time in the arena, Zalara felt the sting of vulnerability, a sensation she had long since learned to suppress. The moment of hesitation passed. Her instincts took over. With a fierce growl, Zalara launched herself at him again, faster this time, anticipating that he would attempt to evade her. Her claws gleamed in the artificial light as she swiped at him with deadly force. She knew her strength, her speed, and she trusted in them completely. There was no way this human could match her raw power. But Dorian was ready. He sidestepped her strike effortlessly, using his own momentum to spin behind her in a move that was fluid and precise. Zalara's back was exposed for the briefest of moments, and in that instant, Dorian's arm shot out, grabbing her by the waist and yanking her toward him. His grip was firm, unyielding, and though she could feel the strength in his hold, it wasn't the kind of strength she expected from a human. It wasn't raw, physical power, it was technique, an understanding of leverage and motion, something that seemed almost practiced. She growled again, her body twisting, and with a swift elbow, she slammed into his side, knocking him off balance. But Dorian didn't fall. Instead, he used the momentum to roll, to recover quickly, and in the blink of an eye, he was back on his feet, ready to face her again. He wasn't giving her an inch. It was becoming clear to Zalara now this human wasn't like the others she had faced. He wasn't trembling in fear or panicking in the face of a superior opponent. No, this human was calm, controlled, and far more dangerous than she had ever anticipated. The audience, which had been quiet in the beginning, now erupted into noise, a mixture of cheers and gasps. They had seen warriors from all across the galaxy fight in this arena, but never had they witnessed something like this. A human, standing toe-to-toe with Zalara, a T-Rex warrior queen, and matching her with every move. This was no fluke, no lucky hit. This human was formidable. Zalara could feel the weight of their eyes upon her, and a surge of pride rushed through her. This fight wasn't just about her reputation. This was about proving something much deeper, something more primal. It was about dominance. And she wasn't going to let a human take that from her. She couldn't. Her pride, her identity, was bound to this moment. She circled Dorian, sizing him up, her body shifting gracefully, the muscles in her legs coiling like springs. She would finish this, she told herself. One final strike. She wasn't going to waste any more time. The human had proven himself strong, but strength alone would never be enough to defeat her. With a sudden burst of speed, Zalara lunged again, this time feinting a high strike before dropping low, sweeping her claws towards Dorian's legs. The move was a perfect example of her mastery of the battlefield, a trick she had used countless times before to disorient and strike her enemies where they least expected. But instead of retreating, instead of trying to block, Dorian reacted instantly, his body shifting in ways that seemed impossible for a human. He dropped to the ground just as her claws missed him, his hand reaching out to grab her arm mid-motion. Zalara felt a jolt of shock as he twisted her arm with a move that was both quick and efficient. She hadn't expected this. Her arm was forced behind her, her body bending in the direction he controlled. For a moment, everything in her mind screamed to break free, to overpower him with sheer strength. But the human had already anticipated her moves. His grip was firm, unshakable. She couldn't break free. The tide of the fight had shifted in an instant. Dorian spoke, his voice calm, his breath steady despite the physical exertion. "You're strong," he said, "but strength alone won't win this." For the first time in their encounter, Zalara felt an emotion she hadn't anticipated: frustration. The words were simple, but the meaning behind them cut through her like a blade. She had never been defeated by words, by strategy. Her strength had always been enough. But in that moment, Dorian was proving that he had something more, something deeper. Her body tensed, and she gathered all her strength, pushing against his hold. She twisted violently, breaking free with a ferocity that sent Dorian stumbling back. Her claws extended, and she prepared for the final attack, the one that would end the fight once and for all. But Dorian didn't retreat. He stood tall, his expression unreadable, his stance grounded. He wasn't backing down, not an inch. His eyes locked onto hers, unwavering. In that moment, Zalara understood. This fight, this challenge, wasn't about strength or speed. It was about something else entirely, something she had never considered. The human before her had faced countless adversities, and he had survived. He had mastered the art of thinking, of anticipating his opponent's every move. And in that moment, she realized that she had underestimated him in the worst possible way. Her claws retracted, and she lowered her stance, taking a step back. She was no longer just the queen of the T-Rex. She was something else now, someone who had been confronted by an opponent who had forced her to rethink everything she knew about combat. The fight was far from over. But Zalara knew one thing for certain. The human warrior, Dorian Drake, was not someone she could defeat with brute force alone. This fight would require more than that. It would require her to adapt. It would require her to change. Chapter 2. The Shift. The battlefield, once filled with the intense crackling of energy and the sound of clashing weapons, had grown quiet in the aftermath of the brief standstill. Zalara stood in the center of the arena, breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling as she considered her next move. She had fought many battles in her life, faced countless warriors from every corner of the galaxy, but there was something different about Dorian, something that she hadn't anticipated, and it shook her in ways that she couldn't fully comprehend. The crowd around them murmured, their excitement palpable. They had witnessed the impossible, the T-Rex queen, the undefeated champion, locked in a battle with a human. The odds had been stacked against him, but somehow, against all expectation, Dorian had not only survived, but had managed to force Zalara into a corner she rarely found herself in. She had been made to pause, to reassess, to recognize the value of something she had long since dismissed. She hadn't come here to be challenged in this way. Her entire existence, her life, had been defined by her strength. She had built her empire through blood and conquest, through overwhelming force and terror. She had crushed countless beings who had dared to stand against her, and she had done so without hesitation. But here, in this moment, she was forced to reconsider her own limitations. Dorian, on the other hand, stood across from her, unyielding, his chest heaving as he caught his breath. There was no arrogance in his posture, no taunting smirk. He wasn't looking for a fight for the sake of glory. He was here because he believed in something more. And that belief, Zalara now understood, was something that she had never considered, something she had lost long ago. The silence in the arena was thick, the crowd's anticipation hanging in the air like a heavy mist, waiting for the next move. Zalara stood facing Dorian Drake, the human who had disrupted the certainty of her victory. For the first time in years, she wasn't sure of herself. This was no mere skirmish. This was a confrontation that had left her questioning her own assumptions about what it meant to be a warrior. And as the seconds ticked by, she realized that her usual tactics would not suffice. Dorian stood across from her, every muscle in his body tense, yet poised, his gaze unwavering. His expression was calm, but there was a fire in his eyes, a determination that Zalara could not deny. This human was different. She had thought him to be nothing more than a brief distraction, an opponent to defeat with ease. But now, he had earned her respect in a way that no one else had. Zalara, though proud and unyielding, could sense the moment of change. Her body still hummed with energy, her heightened senses on alert, but the confidence she had carried into the fight had faltered. This human had shown her that there were other forms of power. It wasn't just about overwhelming force or brute strength. Dorian's control, his ability to adapt, to read her like an open book, it was something she had never had to contend with before. And it made her realize something crucial. If she didn't change, if she didn't rise above this moment, she would lose. The arena's atmosphere shifted from tense silence to an electric buzz. The energy that had been building up now seemed to manifest physically, vibrating through the air, connecting the two warriors. The crowd was restless, eager to see how this fight would end, how the Queen of the T-Rex would respond to this unexpected challenge. No one had ever seen her hesitate before. This moment was new not only for her, but for everyone who had witnessed her rise to power. Zalara took a deep breath, resetting her focus. The world around her disappeared as her senses sharpened. The arena, the crowd, even the lingering hum of the ship above, they all faded into the background. There was only the battle now, only her and Dorian. The force of his presence in the arena was undeniable, and Zalara had to acknowledge that for the first time in a long while, she was not in complete control. Impressive. She finally spoke, her voice low but laced with a hint of admiration, her violet eyes narrowing slightly. You are unlike anyone I have faced before. Dorian's face softened slightly, but he didn't speak, keeping his eyes locked on hers. Zalara's words were not a concession, nor were they a sign of weakness. They were an acknowledgement of the fact that Dorian had, indeed, earned the right to stand against her. And in this moment, she realized that the battle could not simply be decided by a clash of strength alone. It would be a test of their resolve, of their adaptability. Without warning, Zalara lunged at Dorian again, but this time, it was different. She no longer relied solely on speed and power. She used her years of experience to feint, to create an opening, to deceive him into thinking she was going for a direct attack, when in fact, she aimed to test his reflexes. Dorian didn't flinch. Instead, he twisted his body, predicting her move just as she had predicted his before. They collided, a brief struggle of strength and agility, neither giving an inch, both of them locked in a deadly dance. Zalara's claws scraped against his armor, and she felt a rush of frustration. This human, this warrior, was not easy to overcome. But just as she thought she had him, just as she saw an opening in his defense, Dorian surprised her again. He wasn't just using his strength or agility. He was reading her, understanding her tactics before she could fully implement them. Every move she made, he countered with calculated precision, forcing her to adapt. And Zalara, despite herself, found a small part of her that was fascinated by this human's resilience. A sharp pain shot through her side as Dorian's knee connected with her ribs, knocking her off balance. She hissed in pain but recovered quickly, her reflexes sharp enough to twist, and avoid a follow-up strike. For a moment, they stood facing each other, both panting, both watching the other with a newfound respect. The fight had shifted. It was no longer about the physical battle alone. Now, it was a battle of wills, of minds. Zalara knew she couldn't continue to push the fight the same way. She needed a new approach. "You're good," she said, her voice edged with respect. "But you'll need more than that if you plan to defeat me." Dorian didn't respond immediately, his breath steady, his eyes calculating as he watched her carefully. There was a brief moment of silence, but it wasn't one of hesitation. Both warriors were aware that this was not a typical combat scenario. They were no longer just fighting for the sake of victory. They were fighting because the stakes had escalated. This was no longer a fight to prove dominance. It was a challenge to see who could truly push beyond their limits. Zalara stood tall, her confidence returning, and without a word, she surged forward again, but this time, with a different purpose. Her movements were a blur, faster than before, as she shifted her tactics once more. This time, she used feints, misdirections, tricks that had worked countless times before, trying to keep Dorian off balance. But even as she delivered blow after blow, she could sense that he was no longer caught off guard. His mind was as sharp as hers, his every reaction calculated, and she realized that no matter how hard she tried, this fight would not be won with brute force alone. And that realization, though disconcerting, was what pushed Zalara to her limits. For the first time in years, she felt challenged not by his strength, but by his mind. The battle raged on, each move calculated, each strike more deliberate than the last. Dorian was proving himself worthy of his reputation, worthy of being a true adversary. Chapter 3: The Moment of Truth. The tension in the arena was suffocating now. The crowd, which had once been filled with loud shouts and applause, was now silent, watching the two combatants as if they were witnessing a spectacle that was beyond anything they had ever seen before. Zalara and Dorian were locked in a deadly duel, their bodies moving with lightning speed, their strikes coming so fast that the spectators could hardly keep up. Each hit landed with a force that shook the ground beneath them, but neither seemed willing to give up. They were both warriors in the truest sense of the word, resilient, cunning, and unwilling to accept defeat. Zalara's claws slashed through the air, her movements fluid and fast, but Dorian's reflexes were sharper than she had anticipated. He was a human, yes, but he had trained himself to a degree that rivaled the best of her people. Each of his strikes was precise, each of his movements calculated. The longer the fight dragged on, the more Zalara realized that she had underestimated him. The human before her wasn't just a warrior. He was something more, something that defied logic. The battle raged on for what seemed like hours, each move more calculated than the last. Zalara began to notice the signs of exhaustion creeping into Dorian's body. He was breathing heavily now, his movements slower, but there was still fire in his eyes, still a determination that refused to die. And Zalara felt it, too. The fire in her own chest, the pride that drove her to keep going, no matter the cost. But then, in the blink of an eye, Dorian made a move she hadn't expected. He feinted to the left, then, with a fluid motion, he swept his leg under hers, knocking her off balance. Zalara stumbled for the briefest of moments, and in that instant, Dorian's fist connected with her side, sending her sprawling to the ground. Pain exploded through her ribs as she fell, the force of the blow enough to make her head spin. For a moment, Zalara lay on the ground, breathless, her body aching with the force of the impact. She was disoriented, and for the first time in years, she wasn't sure she could get back up. And yet, she knew she had to. Zalara lay on the ground, her body momentarily stunned from the force of Dorian's blow. The pain in her ribs was sharp, and her breath came in short, pained gasps. For the first time since the battle began, she felt a creeping doubt, a crack in the armor of her confidence. This human, this seemingly frail creature, had just put her on the ground. The crowd's silence was deafening as they waited, their eyes wide with disbelief. It wasn't just that Zalara had been thrown off balance, it was that, in that single moment, she had been shown something profound. She could lose. The universe had given her every advantage, strength, skill, the might of her people's warrior heritage, but Dorian had shown that sheer physical power was only one part of the equation. His mind, his adaptability, his understanding of the battle, it was what truly made him a formidable opponent. Zalara's mind raced as she pushed herself up, feeling her muscles strain, the familiar weight of her pride and warrior spirit pushing her forward. She couldn't afford to show weakness, not in front of the crowd, not in front of the man who had pushed her to the very edge of her abilities. She wasn't about to let him win. Not yet. With a growl, she rose to her feet, her claws extending once again as she stood tall, her breathing now steady, the pain in her side something she would ignore. She focused on her opponent, who stood across from her, his eyes locked onto hers, waiting for the next move. He wasn't showing any signs of slowing down. There was no hesitation in his posture, no sign that he was tiring. His presence had shifted, no longer just defensive, but offensive. He was ready for whatever came next. This was it, the final phase of the battle. Zalara's body tensed as she gathered her remaining energy. The fight had already shifted in ways she had not anticipated, and now, it was time for her to adapt, to evolve. Her pride would not allow her to retreat. She had to dig deeper, to push herself beyond the limits she had set for herself. Dorian Drake was no longer just an opponent, he was a challenge that she had to overcome, not just for her own survival, but for her honor. Without warning, she launched forward again, but this time, there was a change in her tactics. Instead of relying purely on speed and strength, she moved with more deliberate steps, using feints and misdirection to confuse him, hoping to throw him off balance. She struck low, aiming for his legs, forcing him to shift his weight backward, but Dorian was too quick. He countered with a swift pivot, his body moving almost faster than she could react. His legs shot out, sweeping hers off the ground in a perfect counterattack, sending her spiraling to the side. She barely managed to roll with the fall, her body crashing against the cold, unforgiving surface of the arena floor. Zalara's heart pounded in her chest as she pushed herself back to her feet. This wasn't just about a battle anymore, it was a test of wills. The strength of her body and the sharpness of her mind were now fighting for dominance, and Dorian was showing her that he, too, had the same tenacity, the same refusal to back down. She wasn't just fighting for survival, she was fighting to prove that the T-Rex were the ultimate warriors, that she was the embodiment of that power. Dorian stood opposite her, his face set in determination. "You're stronger than I expected," he said, his voice calm, his chest rising and falling with each breath. "But you're underestimating me, Zalara. Strength isn't everything." Zalara snarled at his words, the audacity of the human speaking to her, so casually driving her to the edge. "Do not mistake your endurance for victory, human," she growled, her voice low, full of barely contained rage. "I am Zalara of the T-Rex, and I do not lose." She surged forward once again, but this time, she was more controlled. She wasn't just reacting to his movements, she was anticipating them. Every step she took, every shift in her stance, was calculated. Her battle sense sharpened as she analyzed Dorian's every motion. His posture was perfect, he was anticipating her every move, just as she had anticipated his. This had become a fight of intelligence, not just brute force. Zalara's claws slashed toward him, but Dorian parried, his arms moving with precision, redirecting her strikes as though he had studied her combat style. The force of their clash reverberated throughout the arena, shaking the very ground beneath them. Sweat poured from both of them, their bodies pushing to the limits of what they could withstand. Zalara's mind worked faster now, processing the battle as it unfolded, adapting to Dorian's moves, recognizing that he had learned her style, had learned to predict her moves. She had to evolve, and quickly, if she wanted to avoid defeat. Then, in a split second, it happened. As Zalara launched a brutal upward strike, Dorian sidestepped, his arm locking around hers. He twisted with a sharp motion, using her own momentum to throw her off balance. For the briefest of moments, Zalara was completely exposed, her defenses down, and that's when Dorian moved. With a fluid motion, he swept Zalara's legs out from under her and sent her crashing to the ground. The impact was like a hammer to her chest, knocking the wind out of her and leaving her gasping for air. Her body trembled from the force, her mind reeling as she realized that, for the first time, she had truly been bested. The arena fell silent. For a moment, everything was still. Zalara lay on the ground, staring up at the sky above, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. The human had defeated her. There was no way around it. His skill, his precision, had overwhelmed her. The T-Rex warrior queen, undefeated in all her years, had been brought low by a human. Dorian stood above her, his chest heaving with exertion, but there was no smugness in his posture, no taunt in his expression. He offered her a hand, his face solemn. "You've earned my respect, Zalara. But strength is more than just power. It's about adaptability, strategy, and the will to learn. And you taught me that." Zalara, still on the ground, looked at his outstretched hand. She could feel the weight of her pride, but she could also feel the reality of the moment settling in. This was the end of the fight, and she could not deny it. Slowly, with great effort, she reached out and took his hand. As he pulled her to her feet, the crowd erupted into applause, not just for Dorian's victory, but for the way the battle had been fought with honor, with respect, and with an understanding that transcended their differences. Zalara stood tall once more, her body aching, but her pride intact. She had lost, yes, but she had learned something more valuable than any victory. She had learned that even the strongest could be surpassed. And in this human, this warrior, she saw a reflection of something she had once thought herself alone in possessing true strength. Chapter 4. The Aftermath. The battle was over, but its impact rippled far beyond the arena. Zalara, the queen of the T-Rex, had been defeated by a human warrior, and the galaxy had taken notice. News of the battle spread like wildfire, carried on the winds of communication networks, and soon, every corner of the galaxy knew the name of Dorian Drake. But for Zalara, the outcome of the fight had shifted something deeper within her. She had entered the arena expecting to crush a mere human beneath her, to prove that she was the undisputed champion. Yet, as the battle unfolded, she realized that there were more ways to win than simply overpowering an opponent. Dorian had shown her that strength wasn't just about size or might, it was about intelligence, adaptability, and the will to never give up. As Zalara sat alone in the quiet aftermath of the fight, reflecting on the battle, she felt a new understanding beginning to form. The universe wasn't a place for rulers who relied only on brute force. It was a place for warriors who could adapt, who could evolve, and who could learn from their mistakes. Dorian had taught her that, not through words, but through action. Zalara had never been defeated before, but perhaps, in this moment, she realized that there was something far greater than victory, the ability to rise, to adapt, and to acknowledge one's own limitations. It was something she had never considered, but now, it felt as if it was the key to her future. Dorian Drake had proven that humans, in all their fragility, could stand toe-to-toe with the mightiest of warriors. And for that, she could respect him. And perhaps, in time, they could fight together for a galaxy that would need both of their strengths.